I hadn't seen Star Trek. I had flipped the channels and seen these corrugated boxes and stuff that was styrofoam, and obviously not rocks and not what they were supposed to be. And I just kept flipping. I thought it was probably a really bad show. But when I went in and gave the reading and they liked it, they asked me to wait. And I waited in the anteroom. There was the anteroom and then there was Gene's office. And 15 minutes went by, 20 minutes went by. Nobody came out. And I waited and I waited. The sun started to go down. And I'm still waiting. And then a guy comes in and says, "Are you Walter Keon?" I said, "Yes." He says, "Come with me." And that fellow was Bill Tice, the costume designer for our show. Well, this is somebody at least who had a mission. So I went with him like a little puppy dog. We went to the wardrobe, my hand to God. He drops onto his knees in front of me, puts his hand on my crotch. I do not see the measuring tape that he has in his other hand. And I say, "What are you doing?" He says, "Well, I have to measure you for a costume, don't I?" And that's how I found out that I was on Star Trek. This was Gene's idea. This was his focus. This was the revolutionary aspect of our series. Without making a case, without standing it out in relief and saying, look what we're doing. These people were there, and the fact that they were there on such a casual basis was more even to the point, that we were at a time when it was just not an issue, when having that kind of multi-racial, multifaceted crew work together. Ultimately, that's what I think is the most profound comment you can make about Star Trek. We had stories that dealt with that, to be sure, but we also had stories that didn't deal with humanitarian causes or civil rights. But what was always there was that bridge and those actors, and you saw them every week communicating with each other. And that was the thing that was different. You certainly got the picture that this was very important to Gene. He was driven to make personal statements about things he cared about in the stories. He wasn't ignorant of miniskirts, but certainly this was very important to him. And I think some of the contentiousness that he had to deal with and was a part of had to do with feeling very strongly about communicating the feelings he had about people and humanity and civil rights, etc. I was the new kid on the block. I found being on the set every day fun. I thought Bill was very funny. He made all the jokes as well as being closest to the camera. And there couldn't have been a better choice for Captain from the point of view of his commitment to his work, to his investment in everything that he did. Bill was the life of the party, and he knew I was there. He saw my shadow several times. "Oh yeah, there you are." But other than that, I had very little to do with him. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't angry, he wasn't hostile. He just really gravitated towards Leonard and DeForest, embraced them at the sacrifice of the rest of us. Gotta understand, this was the 60s. There was a caste system, C-A-S-T-E, caste system, on television. They were the primary leads, the ones that are really the principal actors. And then there's the supporting performers who were there every week but did not get as much attention. And we were the supporting people. Bill he went along with what was going on. We were not given credit at the opening of the show. We were mixed in with the guest actors at the end of the show. So there was no reason to treat us any differently. There was an unspoken attitude that we were not as important. And we weren't. Our scenes were a dialogue that promoted the story but did not give you a sense of who we were. Captain, there's a ship out there. Well, what kind of ship is that? So he got to do that. I got to say there's a ship out there. That's the way it went. And I had no animosity toward him. I understood there was stuff going on between he and Leonard, that Leonard was getting much more attention and much more public approval than had been anticipated, evidently, and that Bill felt competitive about that. But it was okay. It was all okay. Leonard was a little distant, as I recall, But he could smile. There were moments when he joined the party. I found the letter that I had written to Leonard. It was one of the anniversaries of our series. And the only people that were invited were Bill and Leonard. And I wrote Leonard a note because he came to our defense. He thought it was reasonable to expect us to be there. So I wrote him a letter to compliment him on that. I asked him to write a foreword for one of my books. He did that. I had asked him to talk at my Walk of Fame, and he said yes initially, but he was already very ill. And then he got word to me that he wasn't going to be able to do it. So I got somebody else. I got somebody who created Dynasty, who was a friend of mine. And then I heard back from Leonard that he was going to do it. And he came to the Walk of Fame, and he said the words that you say when somebody's having that kind of dedication. And I knew he was not well, but he decided that he couldn't let me down. And he was very ill at the time. And God bless him, he did. He was a good person who got so wrapped up in being Spock that he sometimes forgot that he was actually 100% human being and not 50. Michelle was great. She was very friendly. She was the first one to talk to me when I came on the show. The first 6 or 7 episodes, I wore a wig, a lady's wig, and she was always joking about it, where the birds were that nested in my wig. But we had a moment that probably solidified our relationship. We were doing a convention, and we were backstage about to come on stage, and a guy came up to us, and he had an old ratty magazine, and he opened it up, and there was a picture of Michelle without any clothes on. And I said, "Is this you?" And it said Michelle Nichols on it. And I got really, really upset. I said, "Put that away. What the f*** are you doing with that? I don't ever open that page again." And she didn't say anything. Then about 10 minutes later, I think I was somewhere else, and she came up behind me, and I heard her say, "Thank you." And we never mentioned, but I think that's what made us friends forever. DeForest was one person on the show that really moved totally with ease between all the others. Everybody got along with DeForest. He was totally approachable. We even spoke on the phone. So he was great. I loved working with him. I think he was a great guy, a lovely man. And he had actually seen a UFO. We all pretended to see alien ships on the Paramount lot off in the distance, but DeForest Kelley swore that when he was driving through Atlanta, Georgia, where he was from, he looked up and saw a UFO, something that could not be identified and which was acknowledged in the media the next day that they didn't know what it was. To that day, he still swore that he'd seen this. Jimmy was a little volatile, but he treated me totally as an equal. I never sensed that there was any disparity between us, any reason for discomfort. George Takei was supposed to have been my shipmate, the helmsman, but he was on a movie with John Wayne called Green Berets, and the movie ran over. So it ran over 6 or 7 weeks. So a lot of dialogue that might have gone to George or would have gone to, or would have been at least written for George, was written for me. And so I kept coming back. I knew I was coming back when I looked at the end of the week, when I looked at the show they were going to shoot the next week, because that script would usually come down, and I'd look through it, and I'd see Chekov. Okay, so I'm working next week. And that's the way it went that whole season. I didn't know from week to week whether I'd been working. Although after a while, I got the sense they were comfortable with what I was doing. I didn't sign a series contract. I signed a show contract. So I was there for that episode. And if they found they could use me again, they would write another script with me in it, with Chekov in it. Something that people may not realize, many people may not realize, is that when you're a regular on a show, and I emphasize that, the directors who come and go every week, generally speaking, you don't have the same director week after week. They only direct the guest stars. They figure that the regulars have already established their character and how they would interpret dialogue. So if they say anything, it's good. That's about it. Actually, Joe Pevney was my first director, and I had done the lead in an Alfred Hitchcock hour, one of the leads. I played opposite James Caan, who I'd gone to drama school with. Joe Pevney always found my work good. He saw a great future for me. Mark Daniel took about 6 or 7 shows to crack a smile, but when he did, then we got along fine. But so you were pretty much on your own. The kind of dialogue I had. Aye, sir. Or Vector too, Captain. I mean, you couldn't screw it up too badly. And I had a couple of episodes where there was something to do, and it made me feel good, made me feel like I was valued to some degree. I got a lot of mail from kids 12 and under. Well, I think I had a general sense that that they were hoping that it would attract that audience. When I go to conventions, I say I got a lot of letters in pencil and line paper, Some of them were very touching. Some of them were from minority kids who felt that they were not a part of the culture. And they loved watching Star Trek because of all the different people and all the different kinds of people that were involved. It was very touching. Gene invited me to come to his house between the 2nd and 3rd seasons. And it was for the purpose of telling me what they planned to do with Chekov. And he showed me some literature, correspondence he had had with these 2 guys, Schlosser and Werner from NBC, about incorporating Chekov into the action more, making him part of a bigger part of the story, like that fellow on the monkeys. That's the way he wrote it. He showed me. These were copies of the letters. I remember going away from there thinking, gee, this is great. And then George and Jimmy and I were doing a photo layout for a teenage magazine in the 3rd season. And somebody came up and said, have you heard? Your guys have been switched from Mondays at 8 o'clock to Fridays at 10. And I heard that and I said, oh, that's the end of Chekov. Because Chekov was there for the pre-adolescent crowd. 8 p.m. on Monday was a good time for him. 10 p.m., either the kids are in bed or they're out on dates or something. They're not going to be home watching. There was this sense that we're going to go through the motions, finish the year, and that will be the end of Star Trek. And then we found out that Fred Freiberger was taking over, or had taken over. And the history on Freiberger was that he was a show killer. When the show was going to die, they brought in Freiberger to be the producer. So that wasn't happy news. We knew that it was going to be the end. The only person who didn't think that way was Jimmy Doohan. He was convinced we were coming back for season 4. But I said, that's it, we're done. Up until then, you always held some hope that Star Trek might come back. There were several times in the 70s when we were led to believe, we even went in for a costume fitting. It was for Star Trek Phase 2. It was going to be another series. And I was complimented on the fact that I wouldn't need to have a size change. Got home, the phone rang, and it was off. The whole thing was off. In 1973, Star Trek was still trying to determine what kind of reincarnation it might have. Did come back as a Star Trek animated television series. That was one of the most painful moments, embarrassing moments of my entire life. Because I was at a convention in L.A., Dorothy Fontana was giving a talk, and evidently she announced Star Trek was coming back as an animated series. Their talk finished, the doors opened, people came bursting out. I was standing there, and somebody says to me, and a crowd formed immediately, how do you feel about Chekov not being in the animated series? I had not known that. I knew that we were coming back. I didn't know that Chekov was not going to be in it. And I just stood there, just devastated. I felt betrayed that nobody had told me this, and felt rather insignificant. I'd been with this series. We had gotten along well. I had achieved a niche with fans, and suddenly everybody in the world knows that there's a new Star Trek animated series, but Chekov isn't in it. So it was just awful. And when I mentioned it to Gene later that day, he brushed me off. There was no conversation about it. When Star Trek went off the air, I had nothing. I had a little baby at home. I had no work. The phone didn't ring. Star Trek had been an interval between unemployment, because I'd stopped getting work around 1966, early 67, and then Star Trek came along. After Star Trek went off the air, I went back to not getting any work. So I was writing, and I wrote a screenplay, and I was a terrible typist. I still am. And we were typing in those days. And I paid Susan Sackett, Gene Roddenberry's secretary, to type it up for me. Somehow, I don't recall how this happened. He read it. He thought it was good, but of course, he said it needed work. He said that to every writer that ever worked for him, that it always needed work. So he knew that I had written. I think it was Dorothy Fontana who suggested that I write for the show, since I wasn't going to be in it. And she got in touch with me and asked me if I'd be interested. And I thought it'd be an interesting challenge. It ceased being interesting after the 5th or 6th draft. I didn't know Gene's history, that he had the writers write and rewrite and rewrite. I thought this was an indictment of me and my ability. I literally did 5 or 6 drafts, and then I said, I'm done. I saw it, and I don't recall it being any different from what I wrote. But yeah, it came through Dorothy. And then I found out, which is really remarkable to me, I thought she was a very talented writer. I read this beautiful book on the animation, and there was a quote from her. Infinite Welcome, I thought, was the best episode we did, which was amazing. I never knew anybody felt that way. And that it was Dorothy was really very touching, and I was very flattered. The interesting thing is, when we went to big screen, and we went to action, adventure, pyrotechnics, we brought in a whole new audience. We brought in an audience that was more visceral. And as a consequence, even though we fought to maintain a posture and a statement, we had to take into account these folks, people who were there for the action adventure, if not exclusively, predominantly. Well, it took some convincing to make me believe that we really were going to do a movie. We had so many false starts that it didn't seem like it was ever going to happen. I wrote a book called Chekov's Enterprise about the making of that movie. I'd get some information, or I'd see something happening, and I'd go back and I'd write it down. The thing I remember most about that movie is the second shot that we shot. Sulu, Uhura, and Chekov leave their posts and go to the lift, the turbo lift, and Captain Kirk steps out. So we're standing there, and he's standing with us, and I stood there and I was thinking, my God, it's really happening. We're really making this movie. So it was a euphoric moment, and one of astonishment as well. The Wrath of Khan was really a primer for screenwriting students. It was so well laid out, so well structured. The antagonist, the unstoppable force, and the immovable object. The fact that the evil person is human. He's not a robot. He's not an alien. He's a human. There's a level of identification. He lost his wife, and somebody is responsible for that. And I knew we had a hit. However, the script wasn't the way it eventually turned out. And I had read a first draft. It said that Spock died in the second act. I was floored. I said, you can't kill Spock in the second act. There are 3 icons. There's the Enterprise, there's Kirk, and there's Spock. If you're going to lose one of them, that's a great tragedy. That's real drama, and that's got to be the curtain of your movie. That's got to be right there at the end. And I called him, Harv Bennett. I didn't know him. I hadn't met him. Immediately said, I don't talk to actors. I mean, I was as determined as I guess I've ever been. So he asked me to come in, and I came in and I talked to him, and I talked to the other producer on the show, Bob Sallin, who was a terrific guy. And I said, surely somebody has told you this already. You can't kill Spock in the second act. And he said no. So then he gave me the script. He said, I want you to do a Trekkie run on it. And there were lots of little things, not lots, a few things that I made corrections on. I think they're in the back of my autobiography. It was just a more satisfying experience because the script favored me more. I mean, there was stuff to do. I don't think I was surprised by the success it had. It was Star Trek III that I bet against. No, I had a big fight with Harv Bennett. I went to the studio to read the script for Star Trek III with my agent. I had heard that Chekov's part wasn't as good as it was in 2. So I was a little bit on edge to begin with. Bennett sensed it. He gave us, my agent and me, he gave us both copies of the script, and we sat down and read the script. And I was disappointed. I thought this was 5 steps backwards. And Harv said, when you're done, let me know and I'll come down and we'll talk. And I was willing to sit there. I can be confrontational. I can be candid. My agent said he had to leave, and he drove me, and he had an appointment. So we left together, and Bennett was furious. He was furious, and he called him. Of course, my agent didn't tell him that we left on because of him. He just listened to him tell me I wouldn't work in Hollywood if it wasn't for the Russian accent, and that either I take the deal that they were offering at that moment or leave it. And that was the end. Take it or leave it. There's no more negotiating. And I said, I leave it. I told my wife and my kids, I said, I'm not going to be in the next movie. Next morning, ring! They made another offer, commensurate with what George and Nichelle were getting. I was back on board. Bennett and I didn't talk throughout the whole movie. When we had a screening at the studio, he was there. And I thought it was better than I anticipated. And I went up to him and I apologized. I said, it's a good movie. Congratulations. It's not a great movie. I didn't say that, but it's a good movie and congratulations. So that made it easier for us. The voyage home, dealing with the environmental issue, was really adhering to the whole concept of what Star Trek was supposed to be. That was really well done. It was really very successful. So clever, so ingenious, the idea of the extinction of whales. Bill and Leonard's scene in the truck was great. It was so well performed. They played off each other like Abbott and Costello, I swear. It was just wonderful. And Chekov had a couple of, scenes that he never would have had before. I just was very proud of that movie. We were on location, and I came out on my trailer, and I said, here we are, someplace different than the soundstage. My character is really a part of this story. What he does affects events. I felt, God, it can't get better than this. And that's what I said to myself. It can't get better than this. After Leonard directed Star Trek 3 and Star Trek 4, Bill Shatner directed Star Trek 5, I was wary. I had seen how Bill dealt with us as we were all actors, and I felt it was somewhat belittling, and I was concerned that he would carry that over as a director. To my surprise and delight, he was very, very approachable and very reinforcing as a director. Initially, I was upset, and I said to George and Nichelle and Jimmy, I said to them, if he pulls any of that shit on us, I'm walking. I will not be dictated to. So that's what I was anticipating. I was anticipating the actor who paid us hardly any regard. So we get on the set, and lo and behold, he's a different guy. Aye, Captain. Warp Vector 2. Oh, that was good. I got this whole different personality. He's coming over and kissing us and embracing us, and he's this joyful human being, very dimensionally likable. So, didn't expect that. I did not expect that. In fact, I got to the point where, and I turned to George, we were sitting at our consoles. I said, George, today is my last day. And he said, oh, well, we have to tell Bill. I said, don't tell Bill. Don't tell Bill. He said, no, Bill. And Bill comes over, and this is the Walter's last day. Whoa! I got all this loving. So he was totally different. And although it was not a good movie, I don't blame him. There were things that he wanted to do that he wasn't allowed. In some ways, you could draw parallels between Star Trek V and Star Trek I. We had problems with the special effects. We didn't have an ending that worked. There were things that were beyond control. And I saw Bennett chew Shatner out. I felt that wasn't fair. After we did 5, there was initially a sense that we were done. And then we found out that Bennett was going to produce Star Trek 6. His choice was to go with a new cast, young characters from the Academy. And we lived with that for several weeks. George and I were having conversations as well. And then George he went to Paris. And when this was all still up in the air. And then he came back and he called me and says, "Walter, what have you heard?" And I said, "George, are you sitting down?" He says, "Yes, yes." I said, "George, they're going to do it in claymation." "Oh my God, are they going to use our voices?" Evidently, Harve Bennett gave them an ultimatum. He thought he had the power to do so. And he says, "Either you do my story or I walk." And they said, "Bye-bye." So the sad story is that I was very unhappy with Star Trek VI. I thought, yes, this is definitely the last one. And there should be significant moments for all of the cast. When I say a moment, a couple of pages. So I was in a foul mood throughout the whole shooting of the movie. I had a fight with Leonard. I had a fight with Jimmy. Oh, and I had a disagreement with Nichelle. I mean, bizarre. None of which should have happened. None of which was their fault. But I was really unhappy throughout the entire film. I certainly didn't think we were going to ever come back. I didn't know that I'd be offered a role in Next Generation. And by the way, I turned it down. They had to come to me about 3 times before I accepted. And it was a significant amount of money. Initially, they wanted all of us. They were going to have all 7 of us. When I saw what they had in mind for me, they just were giving me DeForest's lines. So I said I didn't want to do it either. And Berman called me, said, "What would it take to bring you aboard?" I said, "Well, I tell you what, I have in mind the scene between Scotty and I on the bridge in the beginning of the film when Kirk is blown out of the ship. And we stand together, and I tell him how upset I am that we've lost our captain. It would just be a few lines, but it would give us some humanity. It would be more than exposition." Berman said, "Okay." I came aboard. We got to the bridge. I looked at the script. It was there. I liked the director. I really liked him. I thought he was a director. We did the scene. My brother had just passed away, and it was very much a part of my consciousness. And I brought that to play in playing that scene with Jimmy. We're not talking about Kirk. And I cried. I actually cried. And we did it 4 or 5 times. The director was very supportive. And then he said to me, "This time do it without tears." So I said, "Okay." And I did. And it was the same emotion, the same feeling, but I didn't have tears. I went to see the movie. It ain't there, baby. It ain't in the movie. And it could well be, and I say I'm cynical, I'm also a little paranoid. It might be that this was something that they had in mind from the very beginning. Let's placate him. Let's give him the scene and we'll just cut it out. Patrick Stewart cries in that movie. Maybe they didn't want 2 people crying in the movie, which I can understand. There was another scene in which Bill, Jimmy, and I participated. It was right at the beginning of the film, and it had to do with skydiving. And Jimmy and Scotty and Chekov were talking about Captain Kirk doing this stunt that, perhaps we were past that in terms of where we were in our lives. I thought it was fun because I got to wear a whole different costume. And I thought, well, all the little figures that are going to come out will have me in this other costume. Most of that scene was cut out, and what was left never made it into a costume of the figure. I have them all. I have a collection, comic character-related stuff, going back to 1896 through 1968. But I also have all of the Chekov figures. Anyway, that is my experience on the Next Generation film. Todd Stashwish, he's the captain on Picard. He was one of the captains. He lives in my neighborhood. He lives a block away from me. And I ran into him one day. Didn't know who he was because I'd never seen Picard. He told me that he was on this show, and I said, great. And then we ran into each other again and said, I think our showrunner is going to call you about coming on the show. I said, really? He said, yeah. Well, didn't happen for a while, and then I just sort of, abandoned the idea as a possibility. Then I heard from him, and I said, okay. I thought it would be fun. they wanted to do a VO, a voiceover, come to my house. I remember it as being like 5 seconds long, but when I saw it, it was long enough for people to be able to identify that it was me. And it was a dramatic moment. And I had actually forgotten that I wasn't playing me, I was playing my son, Anton Chekov, which was a tribute to the young actor who passed away. So I knocked on Todd's door. I said, "Can I come over the night at screens and see it on your?" He said, "Sure." And he said somebody was going to be there. And he repeated it a couple of times. I didn't know who he was talking about. I didn't remember the name at all. But there's Terry. And first I thought, oh my God, they're going to think I'm really senile. But we ended up sitting on the couch together and watching the show. And I thought it was quite good, actually. And that was it. We spent the couple of hours together. You know, life ain't a movie script. Things don't happen on page 14, you know. They evolve. And our understanding, I think, evolves. It's a curious thing. You think of yourself as either being, you know, stalwart and dynamic and have a lot of confidence, feel that you'll persevere, or you don't. And I really didn't think of myself as being one of those people who would persevere. If somebody else told me the story, I would say, Jesus, how did you manage to go on? Because I don't think I would have, but I did. I did go on, you know, and I waited, and the first role was like 2 lines on The Untouchables, and then I did another 3 or 4 lines on Combat. After a while, I got the better roles. I had a couple of years, 64, 65, and maybe a little bit of 66, when I was working a lot. And suddenly it stopped. 67, before I read for Star Trek, I wasn't getting out at all. And I was trying to figure out why. What had happened? What had happened was that I was always playing younger than I was. And that was an economic benefit, for one thing, to the studio, because they didn't have to hire a teacher. I played Lee Marvin's 13-year-old son. They never say how old he is, but that's the way he's described in the script, in a movie of the week, and it was an anthology series. Oh, I was 26 or something like that. You don't know what's inside you until you're confronted with it. It's like when I was going to the playhouse, when I was going to neighborhood playhouse, I needed a job. I had to work because I had no money. And I got a job at a hospital as an orderly. If you had told me that I could have been an orderly, which is not doesn't require a scientific mind, but it does require having to deal with life and death. People died, I had to take them from their beds, put them on a gurney, take them down to the morgue, take them down, to the place where they put the bodies. Never would have believed I could do that, I went through my share. But you learn over time what you didn't think was possible. I feel bad for the people who perhaps were in my place and gave up on a career idea because they didn't think they could deal with it. Okay, one final moment. It all comes together and it solidifies into this career idea of becoming an actor. I was at the neighborhood playhouse. I loved being there, as I told you. We were doing a scene from Golden Boy, and it was about a boxer who had very poor eyesight and played the violin. What would draw somebody else to that role? To me, it was the violin and the bad eyes. I was looking for the vulnerability. That's something I understood because I was pretty vulnerable myself. I told you I was kind of shy. And this teacher came up to me one day and said, Walter, we all have a personal comment on life. And yours is self-pity. And I thought about that for a second. I said, my God, you're absolutely right. It just hit me like that. That's exactly what I do. That's what I feel comfortable with. Feeling sorry for myself, being this vulnerable creature. And when I realized that, I realized I can make this guy into a smart ass. I can make him into a tough kid. I can do anything with him. I have that in me. And I just needed to find it. So when I went in for Star Trek, Gene was there, and all the other, Gene Kuhn was there, and Joe Pevney, who directed me in the lead role on the Hitchcock Hour, and they asked me to read these lines that were incidentally written for a character named Jones, which was inspired by Davy Jones. The lines were something on the order of, "Captain, the ship is about to explode. What are we going to do?" And I read it and I thought, Jesus, what a great reading. I mean, how else can you interpret that? You know, your life is and nobody, there wasn't that sound in the place. That wasn't awe. That was incredible disappointment. And I thought, what can I do to make them happy? And one of the people, I don't think it was Gene, but somebody said, "Okay, Walter, can you make it funny?" And I thought, what? What? How do you make this funny? So what came out was, "Captain, guess what? The ship is about to blow up." And they loved it. That's what they wanted. They wanted to see if I could be funny. That was the solidifying moment when I got Star Trek. This determined that this was going to be my life, good, bad, or indifferent.